Srimad Bhagavatam, 7th Canto, Chapter 2. Verses 15 and 16.
Kechit kanitrar bidihu Setu prakara gopuran Ajivyang chichidur rikshan Kechit parashupanaya Pradahan sharanan yeke Prajanam jvalatol mukai Kechit. Some of the demons, kanitrai, with digging instruments, bibidu, broke into pieces, setu, bridges, prakara, protective walls. That's a whole class right there. Gopuran, city gates. Ajivyan, the source of livelihood. Chichidu, cut down. Vrikshan, trees. Kechit, some. Parashupanaya, taking axes in hand. Pradahan, burned down. Sharanani, the dwellings. Eke, other demons. Prajanam, of the citizens. Jvalata, blazing. Ulmukai, with firebrands. Translation: some of the demons took digging instruments and broke down the bridges, the protective walls, and the gates, gopuras, of the cities. Some took axes and began cutting the important trees that produced mango, jackfruit, and other sources of food. Some of the demons took firebrands and set fire to the residential quarters of the citizens. Purport by Srila Prabhupada: the cutting of trees is generally prohibited. In particular, trees that produce nice fruit for the maintenance of human society should not be cut. In different countries, there are different types of fruit trees. In India, the mango and jackfruit trees are prominent. And in other places, there are mango trees, jackfruit trees, coconut trees, berry trees. Any tree that produces nice fruit for the maintenance of the people should not be cut at all. This is a shastric injunction. And then verse 16, translation: thus disturbed again and again by the unnatural occurrences caused by the followers of Hiranyakashipu, all the people had to cease the activities of Vedic culture. Not receiving the results of yajna, the demigods also became disturbed. They left their residential quarters in the heavenly planets and, unobserved by the demons, began wandering on the planet Earth to see the disasters. Purport: as stated in Bhagavad Gita, the performance of yajna brings reciprocal good fortune for both the human beings and the demigods. When the performances of yajna were stopped by the disturbances of the demons, the demigods were naturally bereft of the results of yajna and hampered in executing their respective duties. Therefore, they came down to the planet Earth to see how people had become disturbed and to consider what to do. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatidesha Tarine. I think sometimes the demigods get a bad rap. You know, they're kind of depicted as keen to get the fruits of yajna, and they may appear a little greedy in that way. There's a logic, there's a structure to the system. This is described in 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita. There's a reciprocal relationship between humans and nature. And if that relationship is respected, everything is provided. The earth is quite capable of maintaining a much larger population than what do we have now? 6 billion people on the planet? Right. Mother Nature's quite bountiful. And if you ever done any gardening, you know what I'm talking about. You do a little bit of work, prepare the ground and put in some seeds and add a little water, and Mother Nature just keeps giving and giving and giving and giving and giving. It's the most amazing thing to see. So there's no scarcity. But if that relationship is not respected, then it's the reciprocation is disrupted, and there can be scarcity. There can be the appearance of scarcity. In India, Prabhupada used to describe that when he was growing up, you could walk into anyone's garden, vegetable garden, fruit garden, and take as much as you want to eat then. You couldn't take it and walk away with it. You weren't allowed to stockpile from someone else's farmland. But if you're hungry, what a beautiful system that is. Now, if you're hungry, please, please take something. And he was very often, I think, not nostalgic, but he was appreciative of the way things used to be. In the Vedic culture, this more natural way of living. He talked about mangoes, for example. It's described here. You're never supposed to cut down a fruit tree. He would talk about Langara mangoes. These are the mangoes that grow at the top of the tree, and they're the ripest and the sweetest because they get the most amount of air and sunshine and so on. And you know how you get the mangoes from the top of the tree, right? A line of people climb the tree, and they pass that mango quite carefully from person to person until it comes down to the ground. And that's a metaphor for what? Yeah. That's how we receive the Vedic knowledge, is very carefully passing that mango down the line. So it was a very beautiful arrangement. And then somewhere along the line, historically, this might be traced to the Industrial Revolution, to the Enlightenment. It's really only within the last 300-400 years that the definition of what it means to be human shifted, and we became desire machines. There was a time when the dignity of life, the sanctity of life, the sacredness of life was quite commonly known. There was another story from Prabhupada from his younger years in India. He'd say, any rickshawwala, you'd be taking a rickshaw someplace and they'd be chanting Sanskrit verses. Even the simplest, most uneducated person knew that we're not the body, that we're eternal souls, parts and parcels of Krishna. Everyone knew that. Then along the way, with the development of technology, scientists used to be called natural philosophers because there was a rapport between the exploration of the world and the purpose of glorifying God's creation. The early years of science were supported by the churches. There was no antipathy between science and religion in its early days. Then, because religion was mismanaged, and because the representatives of God in the world did such a poor job of it, and it ended up becoming a power play, our church, so, our money, our land, our congregations, and so on. Religion fell into disrepute, and science took a turn toward reductionism and independence from authority. And now it's no longer about being dictated the terms of how to live our lives by church authority, by tradition, and so on. Now it's what we can figure out ourselves with the unlimited power of human imagination and our ability to dig inside the workings of the material energy. We can figure things out for ourselves. We don't need anyone else, certainly no invisible divinities to tell us how to run our lives. And as technology developed, science and technology merged, so that today when people think science, they think technology. Those two things are pretty much synonymous in people's minds. That's not how it was originally, but these days, the proof positive of the value of science is its technology, what it can do. You know, you hold up an iPhone, 90% of the technology in this phone was developed as a result of understanding the workings of subatomic particles, how electrons flow, and so on. So it has, you know, practical value. Science has some meaning. But along the way, we've also lost our souls. We've also lost our sense of life as something sacred. And with that separating of the core self from the worldly self came an increase in fulfilling the desires of the worldly self. Look around. The propaganda around us, the culture around us, is one of you are your body, you are your desires, and the fulfillment of your life is to satisfy those desires. Everything we look at around here is just reinforcing that mentality. So what we're doing here in Krishna consciousness, first of all, it's very anti-consumer, but it's also not anti-science, but it's a corrective measure. And that's an important distinction as well. When Srila Prabhupada would have discussions about such matters, sometimes we know-it-all first-generation devotees would get very strident. I remember one conversation in Paris where one senior devotee was saying to Srila Prabhupada how we were meeting religious leaders and how they're all wrong. Prabhupada said, no, not wrong, incomplete. Big difference. We are not disrespectful of religion. We're not disrespectful of science. We see the shortcomings. Where Prabhupada had a problem with science was with scientists who have an attitude about what they know. That community, that section of the science pie that thinks we've got it all solved. I remember going to one lecture, to a lecture at NYU a few years ago, and it was on consciousness and the brain. Okay, that's going to be interesting. I went with Abhiram. And so on stage there was a very well-known brain scientist from Columbia University, a couple of other people working in neurological studies and consciousness studies, and there was one philosopher. He's like the fall guy. And so the Columbia scientist was saying, you know, we know what consciousness is. We know how it works. It's in the brain. You know, for hundreds of years we were saying we have a brain. It's taken us this long to realize we are the brain. You know, and the presumption of what he understood was so palpable that the philosopher on the stage was visibly troubled by this. And he raised his hand. He said, look, I wonder, does it really compromise us so dramatically to say that our knowledge has not sufficiently evolved yet to really understand what consciousness is all about? And the worst possible thing happened at that moment. They ignored him. They didn't even bother addressing his comment. They just totally ignored him as if he wasn't there. As if you've sold out to the dark side. You know, you're with those religionists and the fanatics and the Hare Krishnas. You know, you're one of them now. If you doubt the supremacy of science, you are now a heretic and you are excluded from funding, which is why so many scientists are reluctant to express, even when they have this very clear intuition that, you know, we don't have it worked out. We can't figure it out. But, you know, if you want to lose your tenure, say something that's against the standard scientific model. Anyway, there was a time when everyone knew we were not the body, but eternal souls, and that we had a relationship with nature. So what a beautiful thing here. where it says the cutting of trees is generally prohibited, and Prabhupada says this is a Shastric injunction. In India, there was, I don't know if they're still there today, but again, Prabhupada speaking of when he was growing up in India, there was a convention that if someone made a statement about something and you doubted it, you would say to them, "What is that, Shastra, that I have to do what you say?" Huh? He read that in the intro to Bhagavatam? To Isopanishad, okay. What, is that some kind of Shastric injunction that I must do it? That's how important, the pronouncements of Shastra were. So you should never cut down fruit trees. What a horrible thing. And yet that's what's going on. We won't mention any names because, you could probably trump me by knowing who I'm talking about. The government just withdrew protections for millions of acres of protected land. Millions of acres are now in Alaska and in the Northwest, now open to exploitation by oil companies and so on. All right. Well, what's the mentality there? The mentality is that the gross national product, how aptly named is that, right? The gross national product is the most important thing. I don't know how many of you listen to news, but on the radio, when the financial report comes on, it's all about whether the markets are up or down, right? And as if someone decided somewhere that when the material fever is high, that's good. We're making making progress. The Dow is up 10 points today. It means the fire is increased by 10 degrees. Isn't that terrific? So what we're doing here in Krishna consciousness is very radical. And it's against the direction, the trend of things. And I was thinking this morning, I wonder if, because this is my theme. My theme song is we're supposed to get involved in the world. That's what I'm all about. Is as devotees, we're meant to understand the issues that challenge the greater humanity and find the language with which to articulate our contribution to those various fields of endeavor. And I said, how am I going to get that across? Okay, I know. I'll go into the teachings of the Acharyas and I'll find examples of how they were involved with social action initiatives. So I started studying Ramanuja, I started Madhvacharya, I went to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. I've got 8 volumes of The Harmonist, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's newspaper at home, and I'm reading all the articles. Nothing. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, have you ever embarrassed yourself in a room alone? It's like I'm getting red-faced trying to find evidence for the fact that Krishna consciousness means getting involved in the issues of the world. Nothing. I said, okay, what about Srila Prabhupada's Back to Godheads? Now there was a rich vein of commentary on social issues. Go back to his first editions in 1944, and every issue of Back to Godhead was about the war, about economics, about statements by politicians, about developments in science. Easy Journey to Other Planets came out as 2 essays in Back to Godhead magazine in 1959. So much commentary. But what was wonderful about rereading these, hadn't read them in a long time, is how deftly Srila Prabhupada took an issue from the world and managed to demonstrate in his writings, in the articles and essays, how Krishna consciousness addresses those issues. It's a beautiful thing to see, and I think that's our challenge. Our challenge is to, and each of us has to do this in our own way. There's no, yes, of course, you can take direction. You can ask your spiritual master. You can take suggestions from God brothers and God sisters. Our job is to meditate deeply on what is the contribution that I can make to bringing Srila Prabhupada's mission out into the world. That's what we're here to do. And each of us has a unique contribution to make. Figuring out what that is, that's our job as devotees. Our job is to figure out how am I going to help move things forward. And because I'm writing a book about Sadhaputta Prabhu, I'm getting deep into that end of things. It's a theoretical realm where the postulates of science, the premises of science, don't hold up to scrutiny. I'll give you one example. Some years ago, a now departed paleontologist, I believe technically was his name, Stephen Jay Gould, very well-known scientist, addressed the quandary of missing elements in the fossil record. If indeed we are solely and exclusively the product of an evolutionary process of survival of the fittest, of random mutations of genes and those things that lend themselves to the sustaining and perpetuation of our species, that gets incorporated into the evolutionary chronology. If that is what we are, the fossil record should reflect that. There should be a clear indication of going from simpler life forms to more complex life forms. And it's not there. There are gaping holes in the fossil record that seem to suggest that something else is going on. So what Stephen Jay Gould and one of his colleagues, whose name I can't recall now, came up with was called punctuated equilibrium. PE. Punctuated equilibrium says that the reason we don't see a smooth transition from one species to another is that evolution doesn't take place smoothly. It takes place in short bursts, in these punctuated bursts of these big spurts of change. Well, I'm not a mathematician, so I can't explain this to you in detail, but Sadhaputta, when this came out, Sadhaputta looked at it, and he said, the math doesn't work. If you calculate how these bursts are supposed to occur, it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Now, he was a PhD in mathematics from Cornell. That was a unique contribution, that he was able to look at something which arguably could have defeated the whole argument that we are not a product of evolution by saying it's a nice idea, but the math doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Pretty important contribution right there. So each of us has a contribution like that. We may not be PhDs in mathematics, but you have some knowledge, you have background, you have training, you have life experiences, things that are unique to you. Those are your treasures. Those are your God-given gifts for devotional service. And figuring out what to do with them is our challenge as devotees. So, thank you very much. I open the floor to questions and discussion. Jai Jagannath Prabhu.
I have a question about when we're training like new devotees and dealing with these sorts of issues, how to view scientists or philosophers and so on in the material world. I often wonder if we, at least in the beginning of our training new devotees, if we should teach or inculcate in them a sort of like total rejection in the beginning on principle, because the scholars of the modern world aren't, in simple language, are not enlightened. When we think about scholarship from like the Gita, the rishis are self-controlled. They've kind of overcome attachment and aversion, and which Krishna says in the Gita in chapter 7 is like, from the very beginning of life, everyone is bewildered by attachment and aversion. So the modern scholars, having not overcome some of these kind of congenital bewilderment of material life, then on principle, even if they present ideas that seem kind of nice or kind of interesting, on principle they should be rejected because they're necessarily defective, having undertaken like a process of yoga for overcoming some of those defects in their consciousness. So I wonder, when we're training new guys especially, if that like kind of really imprint in the mind, like on principle these guys are bogus because of this sort of issue. And then later on, after having gained stronger faith and so on, maybe interfacing with some of these things as required.
Yeah, wonderful question. It's one that's challenged me for a very long time as well, because, you know, in the Bhaktivedanta Institute that Srila Prabhupada established for this purpose, there were two different directions. Bhakti Swarup Damodar Maharaj took a more friendly direction, where he was doing, you might say, a soft approach by befriending the scientific community. He would go to conferences, the Meta something conference or sponsor conferences, and his technique or his style was to ask questions. And there are books that the BI in India has published of his discussions with Roger Penrose and other, these are Nobel laureates in science. And you know, I suppose someone could legitimately ask, well, what's come out of that? You know, what good has come out of that? Well, that's one approach. Sariputta had a somewhat more strident approach. He was more like what you're describing, a little more in your face, you might say. And I've been reading transcripts of Prabhupada's morning walks about science and quotes in his books about science and so on. And there are times when he is extremely concessionary, where he'll say, we have no objection to science. He says, he dedicated Easy Journey to Other Planet to the scientists of the world, with the blessings of my spiritual master. And so he said, they wish to increase their knowledge. We have no problem with that. He said, we had a big problem with those scientists, those individual scientists, who would presume to say that by virtue of what we have discovered, we know now there is no God. There's no need to refer to transcendent causes. Everything is matter. There is only matter. He had a big problem with that. And when it came to that particular sector of the community, he was, wow. I mean, there are some morning walks, I found myself almost backing up. Because, you know, the word rascal was like the single most repeated word in the whole conversation. And I mean, legitimately, I was saying, what's going on here? You know, I mean, I knew Srila Prabhupada. Sure, he could be strong, but he was a gentleman. He was soft-hearted. He was kind. He was compassionate to an extreme, extremely compassionate. So what was going on there? Was there something, was there something from earlier in his life that this was? I was going to all kinds of places to try to figure out why this, you know, really harsh, very harsh. Now, it wasn't all the time, but there were a couple of morning walks in particular where it was, you know, it was like pulling out the heavy artillery. And as best I can surmise, he was concerned that we might be too enamored of the scientific perspective. He wasn't suggesting that we reject science. No, there's some nuance here that needs to be explored more carefully. He was strident, I mean, almost aggressively so. But if you read the transcripts carefully, what you're seeing is he was strident toward individuals. So this, you know, when you were with Prabhupada, very often he would set up this kind of role playing. There was a lot of role playing with Srila Prabhupada. Sitting with him and talking with him, he would take one position, someone would take another position. I remember taking a position one time of a materialistic scientist, and I was so aggressive about it that afterwards he told one of my godbrothers, he said, is Yogeshwara okay? But, you know, I was kind of getting into the spirit of the role playing with him. And so his concern was that we not be dissuaded by people who present their arguments forcefully. He said, be careful, be careful. So that's a kind of a roundabout way of addressing your question. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. I think you have to use your best judgment. When we meet people, some people may present themselves as having been naively convinced of situations, in which case there's an opportunity there to correct that misimpression, and there's no reason not to. On the other hand, if you're dealing with someone who's, let's say, a little more sophisticated, a little more knowledgeable, be careful that you don't end up in a situation where your arguments fall flat because they know more than you do. That you want to be careful about. Generally, people, no matter how educated, how intelligent, are won over by devotees' character. They meet devotees, they like them. Gee, these people are nice. And they'll come back. Even if they don't agree necessarily with the premise of life comes from life initially. If they like it here, they'll come back. And that was the modus operandi for Srila Prabhupada's mission, at least when we were with him. That was the starting point. The starting point was extraordinary hospitality, friendly, welcoming. No matter how irate, no matter how off the end of the dock they might have been with their ideas of, science or philosophy or whatever, Prabhupada won people over with his character, his friendship, his demeanor, and his care for them. People would walk out of a meeting with Srila Prabhupada and then saying, he's a very spiritual person. They might not have understood anything, but they would say, what a nice person. So that's our secret weapon, is Vaishnava character. Everything comes from that. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj had disciples who weren't particularly educated, but they would be able to go to Mayavadi conferences with highly educated scholars and hold their own because they were transparently pure. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu approached the Mayavadis, was that in Benares? I don't remember where it was. He sat down by their shoes, and the head, was it Prakashananda Saraswati, came over and said, please, you're an elevated sannyas, please come. And so he immediately established an emotional bond, not a philosophical encounter, but an emotional bond. That's our starting point. Sorry, that was a long answer to Krishna Kripapu. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
As far as Prabhupada calling the scientists rascals, and basically Prabhupada had two enemies, the scientists and the Mayavadis, and he said very strong things about them. The scientists, because they present a worldview where there's only matter, and he's teaching service of the individual soul to the Supreme Soul. And if people accept the scientist's worldview, neither exists, so there's no question of the individual soul serving the Supreme Soul. So he saw that this promotion of this idea was destroying the opportunity for self-realization, and it made him incredibly angry. And the Mayavadis say that the individual soul and the super soul are the same, so there's also no impetus of devotional service to the Supreme Soul. So that promoting that doctrine also made him very angry.
Right,
and
very good.
He said serious things about those kinds of people, because he wanted people to have the opportunity for devotional service to Krishna.
Wonderful. That was his mission. We pray every day, don't we? Nirvishesha Srinyavadi Paschatya. Paschatya means America. The land of the Paschatyas. Nirvishesha Srinyavadi. By the way, Krishna Kripa Prabhu served with Sadaputa for many years, so if you have questions, you might approach him. I saw some other hands in the back. Haribol, Adi. Speaking of devotional service, arguably the person who has served longest in New York among all of Srila Prabhupada's followers, Hare Krishna Prabhu.
It's time for greeting the deities.
Oh, thank you all very much.
How wonderful is Krishna?
Jai. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.